Welcome to Inside Aesthetics, the world's leading podcast for injectors and aesthetic businesses. I'm Dr Jake Sloan, an aesthetic doctor with over 16 years experience in facial aesthetics.
And I'm David Siegel, an entrepreneur and business mentor with over 20 years of experience in our industry. Our podcasts are aimed at industry professionals, and any information or advice given is general in nature. You should consult with a healthcare provider before undergoing any treatment.
You can also subscribe to us on Patreon for on-demand content for injectable and business education. Good morning or good afternoon, depending when you're listening, guys. This is another of our new industry updates. We have decided to throw in some extra episodes. We won't number these. Our normal Friday podcast will continue as normal, but whenever there's a news flash or breaking news, particularly here in Australia, we're going to try and cover these a little bit quicker. So they might feel a little less polished, these podcasts. They might be a little bit more conversational, but nevertheless highly important. And today we've got a special guest, Dr Gabi Caswell. Anything to add to the introduction to this, David?
No, I mean, we've had various stakeholders on the podcast recently to talk about their position on what's going on with regulations and all the hoo-ha and fuss that's going on in the industry. And, as you said, we've asked the very experienced, well-known Dr. Caswell on. She's been around the industry for probably longer than I have, but we both still look great in our 20s. So we just wanted to get a doctor's perspective that perhaps maybe looks at things from a slightly different view. I mean, that's the purpose of the podcast, is to be balanced and give everyone a platform and a voice to give their perspective. So away we go.
Yeah, 100%. So Gabi, I know that you've got 100 different positions in the past and you're still extremely active and doing important things, but tell us and our listeners, what your background, how did you get into this, and what are you up to these days?
Well, I'm happy to say I'm semi-retired now, so I think that's a wonderful position to be in. Well, I'm semi-retired from medicine, but obviously, Jake, I work in space, and space is very, very big at the moment. So I sort of replaced one activity with the next one. From a cosmetic medicine point of view, I was actually a surgical trainee, and way back in the day, and I did medicine to do surgery. And I was working at St Vincent's, and I got when you say it out loud, it sounds dreadful. I got bored. I got very bored. And one of my colleagues said, I'm a trainer for this sort of Botox stuff. I think you might be good at this. Why don't you come along? And that basically is where I started. Now, back in the day, in the ancient history days, we'll call them, we had two products. We had Restylane and we had Botox, and that was it, So the training was run by the company, and it was, I believe, 2.5 hours. That was it. And the thing that I like to remind people from that era is Bill Diamond was my first rep. Yeah. And Bill is still with me. How good is that? Yeah. So anyway, we started, and I sort of did that. And I said to my husband, I think I might quite like this. Let's explore it a bit more. So I'm a slow mover. I'm a bit of a fence sitter. So we took about 2 years to develop any clinics. We actually went, used it as an excuse to go overseas, and we invited ourselves into many clinics, and we did a lot of research, and we had a look around. And when I opened my clinic, my first clinic, it was the first rural clinic, technically. It was the first clinic to incorporate skin cancer. And basically my view is that sun-damaged skin, one of the reasons that this whole profession exists is we have so much sun-damaged skin in Australia that this is a medical tool that we use amongst other medical tools to fix sun-damaged skin. And, of course, we also have a lot of other pathology like rosacea, acne, that sort of falls on that midline of, medical, cosmetic, because it's to do with appearance. And that's sort of where we started. And then what I did, because I'm a bit of a responsible being, I then looked around and thought, well, I really should join an organisation, and I really should get better educated. I mean, I'm fairly well educated anyway at this stage, but I still wanted more education, because my view is that your power is in your education and your understanding of what you're doing. And obviously, I'm really quite pro-patient activist. In other words, that, this is something that people choose to do. Technically not something we need to do, but that could be argued. And I think that because it's something we choose to do, then really we should reduce the risks of suboptimal outcomes as much as possible. And that comes from education. And it comes from representation, and it comes from talking with your colleagues and learning from your colleagues and your peer review in medicine. And I'm presuming nursing follows the same system. I'm not a nurse, but I'm presuming that it's the same sort of collegiate sharing of information and knowledge. And when I started looking around, there was actually no education. And you have to remember, I'm coming from a surgical background. Now, Jake, I think you did some surgery in your previous life. How important is anatomy?
Yeah, anatomy, and also, introspection, morbidity and mortality meetings and conferences.
Yeah, we're hit with it over the head. And the thing is there was no facial anatomy I could do. Yeah. Literally, there was no facial anatomy. So what I ended up doing, I thought, well, I'll start with the skin side because, I'm still dealing with skin and it's a whole new skill set. So I did my postgraduate diploma from Cardiff, and I also did my master's in skin cancer. And in that time, then basically it was self-taught anatomy. So I pulled out all my grades again and went back through everything. But as we know, anatomy in the face is very fluid. But then I petitioned Allergan, and Allergan eventually put on some anatomy course. But we have to remember, in the day, we did not have Zoom. We did not have FaceTime. We'd only just maybe, what did we get, the iPhone 2006? So I had a Nokia flip, the titanium flips. I was so cool. But, I think that we have to remember, back in the day, it was about, you met in the classroom, you met together, you sat down and we exchanged and we taught people. And there was just this gulf in this area. We're injecting into the face, and maybe I'm just a nervous Nancy. There was no education. So I got involved with the CPCA because it was the only organisation. And I said,
just to cut you off. So that stands for Cosmetic Physicians Society
of Australia.
College of Australia. Sorry, yes.
No, before it was a college.
Yes.
Okay. So I basically got involved with them, and I said, Gabby question, what do we do for the members? Oh, well, no. What do we do? I said, do we just put on tea parties? I said, there's a vehicle here that we can professionalise and basically provide very good education. And that's sort of where it started. And I guess I've always been involved in education. Remembering this is not my first career. I had two whole careers before I did medicine at uni. And so I've always been involved in education and public outreach and a lot of other things. So for me, it was probably a bit of a no-brainer. But it was also this gulf, this yawning black hole, which I just felt decreased patient safety, because I love cosmetic medicine, but we shouldn't have suboptimal outcomes if we can avoid them. And it's the happy end of medicine, I say to people. We're so privileged to work in an area where our patients are not unwell. And therefore, we want to maximise our whole experience, not only for the patient, but also for the carer. So that's where it all started. And I was probably a little bit too good at it, even if I say so myself. And I got to a point where I had other projects I needed to do. So we moved the CPSA to the college and put it into a not-for-profit status. And I actually left because I wanted to finish my Master of Arts. So I do have other careers. It's sort of, I guess, bit of a schism for most people. But I am a trained archaeologist and anthropologist. And so I did my Master of Arts with the Trinity St David's College, and sort of my thesis was on the Aztec New Fire ceremony. And then from there I sort of puddled around a bit more and did my Master of History because it was something I needed to get out of my system. And then ACAM approached me and said, look, we're sort of at a bit of a way station here. And I said, well, the CPCA seem to have attracted perhaps the older established doctors. Maybe they were the doctors to begin with. But ACAM seemed to be attracting all the younger ones. And again, there was a gulf of education. But now, of course, we've moved on a little bit. And within that moving on, basically, and again, I've said it for years, if you fail to regulate yourself, you will be regulated. And that's exactly what's happened. And we had to basically look at what solid education we could offer people. And when I mean solid, I mean, independent of supply companies, independent of colleges, independent of vested interests that run RTOs. I mean something that's actually quite recognised. So we approached the Queen Mary University of London and the University of South Wales. Now, the reason we approached them is they actually have established streams of education. And I approached 5 universities with a full master's in cosmetic medicine for this exact purpose in Australia. And they all turned it down, and they all rang me during COVID when they needed online income. And I said, oops, sorry, we've gone elsewhere. But there was that opportunity missed, if that makes sense, to, put us in that situation where, we could have something local that people could do. But in the end, these were 2 very well-established diplomas come masters, if you wanted to roll it over and do a thesis. And I think that they offered that independent stamp of knowledge, if that makes sense, like all degrees do, because you can't cheat on it, if that makes sense.
So just to summarise, there was a college called CPSA years ago. Then they changed to the CPCA, I think it was 2016.
Something like that, yep.
You felt like it maybe wasn't modern, or it attracted a different type of doctor. Then
well, I think it had a membership. It drew on a membership from the established doctors. So the first generation of cosmetic physicians.
Okay, fair.
Yeah.
And then you said there's another college called ACAM, Australian College of Aesthetic Medicine, that you became the president of. And you potentially tried to formalise and get training recognised, sort of regulated, and have a stamp of qualification on there. And we're still not there. Is that essentially what we're saying?
Well, we sort of are. And what we erected were 3 pathways to fellowship. And one of the things that is quite important for everybody to understand is that in medicine, fellowship generally means a very archaic model. Now, okay, if we're operating, I get it. But in cosmetic medicine, as I said for many years, people are very reluctant to train their potential competition. And I think that's just a fact, isn't it? Like, let's just say it out loud. So therefore, if you want high education and understanding of your craft, we have to look for other mechanisms and other ways of delivery. The other thing is all our people work, whether you're a nurse or a doctor, whatever. So we were really deliberately looking for flexible delivery. So in your own time, basically. Now, my time is 11 till 3 in the morning, and it always has been because I've had busy children, busy lives, and I don't sleep, as anybody who knows me will know. And therefore, so my quiet time is 11 till 3. And I know that there are a lot of people out there in the same situation. So it had to be accessible, it had to be doable, it had to be bite-sized, it had to be credible, and it had to be independent. They were sort of my criteria. So that's what we've set up. And we also have a nurse associate program. So, there is a full program there for those interested nurses who want to do the pathways. And then what we did to sort of sweeten the deal is that you get quite a lot thrown in from the ACAM point of view for free. That's just part of your fellowship that other people would normally pay for. And then we also negotiated discounts with the universities. Right. So we made it as accessible as we possibly could. Then, of course, what happened, COVID happened, and we then had to all sort of really, I guess, move to the virtual world and the rise of Zoom, which I think really helped delivered sort of education. And then, of course, what happened was we had the rise in the guidelines. Now, sort of the nursing guidelines, I've gone through them, the ones that were released in Queensland. And I sort of say to people, if you take out the word cosmetic, really that aligns us with what the rest of medicine in Australia has been doing. We have been working under a little bit of a privilege, and that we have, this sort of setup where we've been using telemedicine, which was originally erected for sort of rural and remote practitioners. Okay, and we have to remember the intent of these policies. And then we've sort of gone through an evolution where we've had nurses working alongside doctors, with doctors, becoming independent, becoming, I think, more independent. But what perhaps none of us really probably saw was the rise in the corporates. And that has changed the whole industry and the profession, because we are now moving the clinical care one step back. And I think when we move the clinical care one step back, what's happened is that there's been a change in the landscape. Now, we're not America, and I say this to people, America has a very different system of medicine, and it's direct to the patient. Okay, Australia's never been direct to the patient. Australia has always had rules, always had guidelines. The TGA has always been there. But I negotiated with the TGA many, many years ago because the word Botox was used by patients to mean not only the treatment, but also the product. And if you read the TGA Act, they don't want brand names out there in the vernaculum. So I said, well, why don't we call it anti-wrinkle? And why don't we call it dermal filler? And then we avoid brand names, but we give a communication methodology to patients and clinicians. And that's actually what happened. But of course, what's happened since then, it's sort of become an advertising slogan. And again, when we're not like America, we can't advertise direct to the patient. We have a very different medical system, of a triage system. And we have to respect the rules that we actually work under. We might not agree with them or like them, and I'm not saying I like any of them or all of them, but what I'm saying is under our status as medically registered practitioners, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a physio, it really doesn't matter, does it? These are the guidelines and the rules that we work under. This is the framework we work under. So I think in some respects, maybe as a profession, and this is a big we, and it includes all of us in any dimension, we did not actually meet the board's expectation of what we call the third level of post-conservative discipline. In other words, we would do the right thing to do the right thing. Does it make sense?
Yeah, look, if we can break that down. So you said sort of COVID was a bit of a transition for education, medicine, maybe even regulations. And you mentioned the corporates, which I'm assuming you mean the prescribing companies, people like that.
Probably the chain clinics as well, like the LCAs, the Silks, and so on. Yep.
The volume clinics, yeah.
Yep.
And I mean, again, I'm not taking a side here, but it seems to have worked rightly or wrongly without any issue. No, I mean, there's not evidence to say that someone has suffered as a result of that model of care. And also, we have to remember in COVID, GPs were remotely reviewing patients, prescribing for patients because they couldn't see patients. And everyone celebrated what an amazing tool that was to allow medicine to still function. So, even though maybe it was designed for rural medicine and, outreach nurses,
and also nursing homes.
Yeah. Well,
it's a brilliant tool, but we have to remember when a GP sees a patient, they generally have a history with that patient. They know that patient and they're not prescribing a procedure. Okay. And I think we just have to be maybe a little bit cognizant that perhaps some of these script prescribers are not cosmetically trained.
Mm. I mean, I don't know. Is that proven? That's speculation, but
well, it must have been perhaps enough for it to be written into the telehealth guidelines that you now have to demonstrate CPD. Right, and the other thing is yes, we say it there's a model of care. Maybe it has worked, it hasn't worked. I would have to say we don't see what the board sees. We don't see the complaints that the board sees, and we don't see what makes it through the HCCC to them to evaluate. And I think that, obviously there's a privilege they have that we don't have. They have information that we don't have. And we may have to actually appreciate that maybe we don't sit there in the glowing orb of light like we think we do. And again, it is a big we, because it's all of us, because, I have actually asked the board, look, I think cosmetic medicine is a separate discipline to surgery. And I do, because it is in every other domain, but they won't separate the two. And that's why the guidelines are together. And, so they have a view, and regulators, their job is to regulate. They have a view and they have a standard of behaviour and outcome which they are aiming for. And I think that we don't have the privilege to have all the knowledge that they have. And I think that's an important thing, that we might be thinking we're doing really well, but maybe we're not doing that well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, why do you think they lump them together? Because, it's not like podiatry is the same as orthopedic foot surgery. It's totally different.
Exactly. And I don't know. I have actually formally asked them to separate it, and they've said, no, we're comfortable. I'm like, okay. Yeah, I can't make people do things. I see them as completely separate disciplines. And remember that technically the scope of practice is actually limited by your insurance. So the medical board does not dictate scope of practice. Your insurance dictates the scope of practice. And I think this is another issue that, we know that doctors' insurance with all the different insurance, we're risk managed. And, when somebody rings me and says, oh, what do you think about this laser? And I said, well, basically I'll say, if I've got knowledge about it, blah, 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 or I'll say, look, my end advice is always, you know what, when there's a new device, when there's a new procedure you want to put on, when there's something you want to train in, before you train, ring your MDO. If your MDO goes up $10,000 annually, then there's an issue with that. Okay. And I think that's a smart way for doctors to sort of work, is that, if suddenly they're putting up your insurance by $50,000, you got to sit there and think, do I really want to do that procedure? Because insurance and actuaries risk manage. So the premium that you pay is against the risk of the group. And if you're paying a very high premium, or you're in a sector that pays a high premium, then basically there are within that group people who have claims that have had high risk, or there's a number of claims. And that's the way it works, okay? Now, we've just had the terrible bushfires in California. And if people are keeping abreast, I just happen to have a lot of colleagues in California, so I'm sort of a bit across this. And all the insurance companies pulled out and cancelled fire insurance in about 2016 because they're risk managers and they realise the risk of what exactly has happened. So we apply that same formula, basically to our area of medicine. Okay, so I was in sort of category 2 because I ran resurfacing lasers. It was the only thing I did in category 2. But I'm still in category 2. Now, category 2 also has breast augmentation, blebs, all these other surgical stuff. But in that sector, my device was put into that sector because obviously there's been issues. And, I don't know what the issues are. None of us do, because we're not privy to the claims records and we're not privy to the other stack of information. But the thing is that's what I say to people. Now, with nursing insurance, comparatively, it's very, very economical compared to what we pay. I don't think I have a colleague who pays under about $42,000 at the moment.
Can you explain why? Why do you think that is? Is it just scope of practice responsibility?
Yes, yes. And this is under the model we work on, under the model that we are established under. The responsibility and obligation to the patient is the prescriber. Okay? So if you're a doctor who is prescribing and somebody else is your pair of hands, the responsibility lies with you. Now, I have had many a patient come to me and they don't know what's been put in their face and they don't know who's been responsible for their treatment. And that's no indictment on the nurse, okay? This is not an indictment on the nurse. And I've never been anti-nurse. In fact, some of my best colleagues are nurses. I am pro-patient. I think the patient has a right to know who is responsible for their treatment, what they've had by the way of medication. And I've always believed that. And that doesn't matter whether I'm in a general practitioner role, a skin cancer role, it doesn't really matter. I still believe that's the patient right. And it's every patient right. If you are the patient, I believe that is your right to be fully informed. Because you need to make fully informed decisions. And if you don't know who's responsible for your treatment and you don't know what products are being used or medications, are you fully informed?
Yeah, no, I agree. But I can't speak for any of the scripting companies or nurses who do this. But generally, the doctor comes on a FaceTime and says, hello, I'm Dr. Smith. Today, you're going to get 40 units of Botox. So it's verbally done for sure, but also it'd be relatively easy to just give a patient a copy of the script or the treatment record, which is now up for a recommendation.
I think they have to. I know that.
Now they do. Yeah, now they do. Yeah. Again, and then this is what I'm saying. We didn't do it voluntarily. We didn't do it obviously. We didn't put these mechanisms ourselves. We had to be told to do it.
By the way, I meet patients every day who've been treated elsewhere, not by nurses, but potentially by doctors or plastics. And when I say to them, oh, where did you go? Who was it? And what did you have? They have no idea. So this is for everyone, not just nurses.
Or they don't want to tell you, or they'll be dishonest with you.
Correct.
Yeah, well, that too. I mean,
I think there's an onus on the patient to also be honest.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the thing is we know this, and this is why the clinician's skill, and when I use clinicians, I'm using the we term again. It's very empirical, the we term. It's the clinician's skill as well to ensure that you're practicing safe. And, I've had patients who, no, I haven't had that. No, I haven't had that, haven't that. And then you sort of put your hands on them. And this is, again, perhaps why I think there has to be sometimes a physical examination. You have to put your hands on them and they go, oh, what's that in your nasolabial fold? That feels a little bit like Aquamid. Oh, that's right. I had that, and then your body dysmorphic patients who will deny having anything. And then you'll say, oh, what's that scar in front of your ear? Did you have, something cut out there? Oh, well, actually, I had, because then they're not honest. And it's, I don't know whether deceit's the right word, but I think it's part of insight from a patient point of view. And I think this is the clinician's responsibility. And again, it's the we clinicians' responsibility to check all this out. Now, how do you get that education? You get that education through experience. Now, Jake, I'm sure you remember your first day on the ward. I remember my first day on the ward. Were we not bunny in the spotlights?
Yes.
What did we learn in that first week?
To survive.
Yep. And we also learned, how to manage the nurses, how to write a med chart, how to manage patients, how to get the information out, how to write the information down. There is a volume that you learn, not just from textbooks. And if we have just textbooks, no experience, no shepherding, no managing of that system, then how do we be our best in our roles?
Yeah. So the genesis of the aesthetic nurse, as far as I'm aware, started mainly in plastic surgeons' offices, really, when they were sort of wanting to bring this discipline into their practice, and they wanted to focus on surgery and having nurses do treatments within their plastic surgery practice. Fast forward, 15, 20 years later, my good friend Boback that starts Laser Clinics Australia, the market explodes. We've now had a business or an industry that has moved at a rapid pace where the regulations have not been able to keep up. And part of that's due to the popularity of these treatments. They're glamorized. They're sometimes seen as more beauty, less medicine. And it's sort of been almost commoditized. So we're at this point now where we've got a huge industry. We've got, huge amounts of patients. I think it was more than a 10% year-on-year annual growth in Australia. I think we've got the largest per capita patient number anywhere in the world. We're here now. What do we need to do to fix the situation? Because we've got, thousands of nurses. I think 90% of the industry that's non-surgical, I think, is done by aesthetic nurses. They've set up businesses. They've got families that they're supporting.
Absolutely.
We've got patients now that can afford to have these treatments. Whereas, Gabby, when you and I sort of first came into the industry, this was something that was cash under the table.
Sure.
You had to be very rich to afford these things. So how do we unscramble this egg and get to a point where, number one, patients are safe. Number two, things are done legally and in a compliant way, and we're increasing the standards. How do we do this without demonizing a particular group of people and saying to them, well, guess what? You no longer have a career. How do we fix this problem so it's fair and we get good patient outcomes in your view?
Well, I think that, you have to unpack this. I always put things into boxes because I think they're bite-sized pieces. So let's just put things into boxes. The first thing is education, okay? We are now under the system where we no longer need to belong to a college. You need to belong to a CPD home, okay? I'm not quite sure if it's the same sort of landscape from a nursing point of view, but let's just presume it is. You still have to demonstrate appropriate CPD for your scope of practice. And they're the words, appropriate CPD for your scope of practice. Now, I actually work in 5 areas of practice, and I have always treated my CPD like a military operation, and I tick every single area off every year. Okay, so before we had to do a plan, before we had to do that, and it's simply because I do stuff for the federal government as another regulated body, and, I have to demonstrate there. So I'm really cautious that way, that I'm up to date. And I would suggest everybody does the same thing. You treat this as part of your job, okay? This is a professional part of your job. You spend half a day in January and you write your plan. Even if you're a nurse, you can write a plan. You can go to ACAM and we'll give you the template, okay? Because we want people to be good at education. Now, the second thing is you need to reevaluate your skill base, okay? You need to be actually quite honest. Are your skills in all areas up to date? Okay? Now, there's nothing wrong with overdoing education, if that makes sense. I think it gives you a better bolster. And I don't know whether everybody's noticed, but now, whenever I do anything, I'm always asked for my CPD certificates. Okay? So this is becoming a cardinal linchpin in how, as a profession, we're going to be looked at. Okay, so that's your number one takeaway. Sort out your education. Now, again, ACAM has online courses. They're very pertinent. We have one on body dysmorphia. We have one on ethics. Okay, so these have been very well targeted. And we did this before we knew about the guidelines, by the way. So they're up and running. And we have a professional anatomist who teaches facial anatomy. We have free guest lectures. So we've got one coming up in February with Lisa Hackett with ultrasounding on the face. Okay, so we've got more sophisticated, David. I mean, I'm sure you remember we never had any of these tools back in the day.
Oh, now we didn't know what a vascular occlusion was. We were just pointing, shooting, and hoping for the best.
That's it. And what's more, let's just highlight this for the entire audience. We did all the high danger tiger territory areas with gay abandon because we sort of didn't know. Yeah. If that makes sense. Now we do know. We've got no excuse.
Yeah. So, Gabi, are you kind of saying that the regulator, at least for now, has said, you know what, CPD home will be the way of proving competence and continuing, obviously, education, rather than here is the syllabus for injectors and here's the course. So you're saying it's sort of the other way around for now?
Well, we don't have a syllabus, and there is probably a mechanism where perhaps there is an accreditation pathway, but remember, accreditation is about Medicare benefits. And, that's really, we have to think about whether we want to be in that scope, if that makes sense. Okay. And, even if you're a GP now, you no longer have to belong to a GP college to maintain your fellowship. You can take your fellowship title with you and you can just belong to the AMA CPD homes.
Yeah.
Because it's more important that's what the Med Board is looking at. Your registration is tied to your CPD now. So they're telling us, if that makes sense. There's the signal for you. If you want the signal, your CPD, if you don't get your CPD in on time, okay, they will review your registration, and they've said that outright. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and then this is a we, and there are going to be people who are not going to be very happy when I say this, is the corporatization of this craft good for us?
Are you talking about sort of the chain clinics, or do you mean making this accessible to every man?
I'm actually talking about the chain clinics because I think it is actually very widely accessible anyway. Okay, and I think that's something that we need to appreciate. And the same argument, and I'll put this out there, the same argument actually occurs in corporate general practice clinics. Okay, is this a good delivery for us?
And dental too. Yeah.
Okay?
And dental too. I mean, the amount of corporate.
Oh, absolutely. And we're all in this conundrum because old folk like me, it's difficult. Your investment in your retirement is generally in your practice. So, it's difficult because then you have a corporate who comes along and says, well, I'll pay you this much and give you 2 years sunset clause. And it's attractive. But the thing is this attractive, and is this the way that we, never mind what the corporate wants and everybody else, just think about us as individual practitioners. Is this a good way for us to practice? And has it led to this additive issue that we've got now?
Yeah.
And that's something, it's not my sphere, as in I'm not a corporate. I don't remote supervise anybody. It's not mine. But I think we have to ask the question, because we do have so many people employed in these situations, and, the landscape's changing really quite well. It's changed. It's not even changing, it's changed.
Yeah.
And, does this mean that people who run these as a strict business, are they good, I guess, for our craft?
Yeah. I mean, I was involved in the chain clinics for many years, and I had to make decisions every day. And I was lucky enough to come from a background where, even though I'm not medical, I've been around the procedures. I wrote and published a book on this back in 2009 through Fairfax. And I've accumulated a fair understanding of what you guys do and appreciation for what you go through every day. But many of my colleagues who also own clinics they had no idea, and they were putting doctors and nurses potentially in compromised positions where there was commercial realities and pressures versus medical responsibility and doing the best thing by the patient. I
could not have summed it up better.
And I think the technical term is clusterfuck. We've arrived here.
Are we allowed to say that?
Yeah, we are now. It's a problem. And so I think, how do we move forward from here? Because unfortunately, yes, we've got people like yourself who are very concerned about patient safety and making sure we're compliant and doing the right thing. The elephant in the room is there's a large cohort of people who, abuse the regulatory complaint system to, make it difficult for their colleagues. I mean, and we've spoken to the regulators, they're aware of this. They understand that this practice goes on. For me, I think that's reprehensible, because it's a waste of our limited resources that we all pay.
Absolutely. And it's just petty. Look, I have actually worked in many industries, and I still work in many industries.
Yeah.
And, since we're allowed to say the other word, I'm going to say, I really think medicine's bitchy.
Yeah.
It's just, and not non-collegiate, guys, you can be competitive and you can agree to disagree, and we can all have different points of view. Yeah. Mature adults understand and respect the other person's point of view. Yeah. And I think, that it does none of us any good. No. And I think that it's really quite important that, that's why I do the term we. And I'm always, she's anti-nurse. Actually, she's not anti-nurse. And all the nurses that I know, we're incredibly fond of each other. But I have had a lot of nurses in that situation that have come to me, that have worked in a volume or corporate climate, and they've come to me quite distressed.
Yes.
Because something's happened, and they're dropped like a hot potato. And I find that a little unforgivable.
Oh, yeah. Well, they'll be in a situation where, you need to do your Botox in 15 minutes. It becomes this dangerous situation where money and medicine don't work well together, although, it's a necessary evil, because without money, there is no medicine. So it's a difficult one. But I mean, to me...
technically, is it a difficult one? I mean, technically, business... When you apply the McDonald's model to medicine, there's always issues. And it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about hip replacements, if we're talking about toxins, if we're talking about ED. It doesn't really matter, does it? There is an issue, because we're dealing with human beings. And the human beings need to be front and centre in all this argument. And the responsibility of the practitioner, again, don't care what level you are, the responsibility of the practitioner is towards the patient. And if that is compromised, and you're in a situation that is compromised, you actually have to make a decision in your id, in your ego, in yourself, if that is how you actually wish to practice. Now, I'm pretty sure that if you walk out of one clinic, somebody else is going to hire you. And if that's the clinic's attitude, then, and I think even Anne Tonkin said it last time, she said, if you're working for that, walk out, because it's not going to be good for you in the long run. And I think that, this is, and I always say to doctors, they want to be the biggest cosmetic medicine doctor, and I go, why? I said, what you want to do is have a really great practice that's robust and lasts for 20 years. So you don't need to be the biggest. You don't need to be the best, as in, the biggest and the best in the industry sort of thing. What you actually need to do is do your best job and look after your patients well, and the rest will flow, because we have so much sun damage. And again, it's that continuum for me. We have so much sun damage that this is just not going to run out, if that makes sense. Yeah. But I think that you have to decide how you wish to practice. And I do include nurses in this. You can read they can read the regulations. They're not stupid. They can read them, they can understand them, and they can go back to the board and they can read all of our stuff, because the board told us they were going to do this. Okay, they told us. Okay, go back and read, like I did, and refresh your memory on the 2022 bombshell that hit the shelves, and you will see they actually told you they're doing this.
Yeah.
And then they, pulled in the TGA Act, but we were given privileges that maybe we didn't appreciate.
Yeah. I mean, we've got, as I said, we've got all these people now in the active workforce. We've got people, fighting. We've got everyone sort of retreated to, not everyone, but, a lot of people have retreated to their groups. My concern is that just like happened with the plastics when they went after the cosmetics for so many years, the regulators turned around and actually regulated them too. I mean, I've got a couple of close friends who are well-known plastics in Sydney, and, they tried to sue the regulator for anti-competitive behaviour because now they were unhappy with, the efforts that their colleagues had been, so...
it'll hearten you.
I mean, what happens if the regulators turn around and go, guess what, doctors, you're not specialists either. You guys might not be, you don't have a specialty qualification, you're not a dermatologist. Guess what? Only plastics and derms can do this now. Screw all of you. Is that, for me, it's like, you be careful what you wish for.
Exactly.
All this noise is being created.
I have said this again, time and time again. And, look, it's a sort of a love, hate relationship between myself and, most surgeons. And, and I sort of said many years ago, have you thought about this? I said, because there will be unintended consequences. And the unintended consequence of, quote unquote, winning the use of the title surgeon is that now the plastics are in the same bag of snakes. Yep. And they didn't realise that. But then, of course, that has enabled, now we have this endorsement program. And that endorsement program, for endorsing cosmetic surgeons, has now been rolled out to general practitioners and been rolled out to ophthalmologists. So it has, again, disempowered the colleges and the representative bodies. And it's an important concept, that one. But the other thing is that, technically, and I may be wrong about this, so people are more than welcome to go and read it, but if you read the PI of most of the medicines that we use in cosmetic medicine, you require general registration.
Right.
Yeah, Jake's just got it. And that, we have to be, again, quite considerate. They are the rules. That's the operating framework that we work under. And I think that we have been given, as an industry or profession, quite a lot of leeway, but we really didn't behave ourselves. And this is the consequence. Now, and when I say we, not me, I think I've actually done a sterling job at really trying to push education, really trying to make sure that, the standards are up, that people do hygiene, that people do infection control. I've pushed this for years. This is not a new thing, that your anatomy, that you do everything to reduce your risk, okay? Because from a regulator's point of view, and I've been a regulator, so this is a really important concept. So I understand where they're coming from, that from a regulator's point of view, the board's job is to protect the general public, okay? That is their main mantra. And if one of us does a bad thing, and I can remember when I was in high school, we had this first female headmaster back in the day, and I can remember her saying, and we all giggled behind our hands, she said, if one of you is pregnant, you're all pregnant, okay? And it's the same sort of philosophy. Because when the media reports on it and it's sensationalised, okay, we have to remember they often gargle everything, don't they? I mean, I've been called a surgeon so many times, they should just give me an honorary fellowship. And, and I go to great lengths to say, this is what my designation is, And I think that, these things, we know are issues and we have to be precise. Words are weapons, and we need to be very precise on how we now present ourselves. And it's, again, a we. Now, I am very sympathetic in the current climate and environment to people who are looking at maybe a change in their living and their living standards and the way that, I'm very conscious of that. I have children, they've got mortgages and all the rest of it. I get it. But I think that what has actually happened is the rules have not changed. We bent the rules. They're taking us back to the rules.
Can I wheel us back to, I guess, the current topic, which is what you just alluded to, the Queensland sort of fact sheet. So on there, this is sort of ad-libbing and summarising, it says for S4 medicines, there's a explicit mandate of how they're purchased, stored and administered, obviously.
Yep.
Now, it seems to me that there are some people who've interpreted that as it's never changed, it's always been that way.
Yep.
Other people have said, "Oh, no. There's some leeway," and of course that's how maybe prescribing companies have worked up until now, at least. So, where are we? What is your take on what happens with S4 drugs? What should happen?
I don't believe it's ever changed.
Right.
Okay, and I believe that we have been given some liberties. Okay, because I can't imagine that it's not known how this has all been operating. And I think that it's never changed. And people can interpret things. It's really quite interesting. If people want a certain, how do we say? If they want a certain answer, they will convince themselves of that answer. And they've convinced themselves of that pathway. But you can convince yourself as much as you like. What you want, how you want it, is not going to be reflected if that's the regulation. And I think that's an important thing. Like, you can sit there and say, I've done nothing wrong, I've done this and I've done this, and we've been allowed to do this, okay? Just because you haven't been stopped doesn't mean to say you're allowed, if that makes sense. And this is my understanding. It's never changed. Yeah, that is my total understanding.
It's a weird one because, for example, when there was a death in Sydney, I think it's 2017,
yep.
Lady with the breast filler and so on. Many clinics were, raided, if you like, by the regulators or audited, and they would know fully well what was happening, how drugs were prescribed, stored, used. They saw the model. They knew who the doctors were. They knew who the injectors were. They knew how this stuff worked. When the regulators went to other clinics to look at what was happening generally, they would have known how this works.
And they rewrote the New South Wales Poison and Drug Act. And then if you read that, you will know that you're supposed to have a vaccine fridge. You're supposed to have it monitored. You're supposed to have resus on site. If you go and read that, and they were the first, I think Brad Hazard was the health minister then.
Yeah, he was.
That was the first to put in fines for corporates.
Yeah.
And the fine is now $120,000. So, and it's a $6,000 fine for the doctor or a 6-month jail sentence. Interestingly enough, the nurses are not really mentioned. And again, I think it's that responsibility and obligation to the patient sort of theme. So yes, they did respond, but like most legislation and regulations, it takes a while.
Yep.
It just seems like we sort of have had this plethora, boom, 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 boom. But you have to remember, they might have started on this after that incident, and it's taken this long to bring it out. And then unfortunately for us that do all the right things, I'm just going to say one word, Lanza. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, so if we just sort of play this out from here, if those regulations stand, and let's hypothesize that those regulations then filter down to the remaining states in Australia, which is possible because of precedent, and we understand.
Yeah, and also with the AHPRA board, remember, if it goes through Queensland, it's sort of adopted nationwide. I don't quite know how that one works, but
right. So let's play this out. That comes through. Effectively, you'll have closure of a huge portion of the industry because the business models that they created will no longer be financially sustainable because they won't be able to have doctors on site. You'll have thousands of people closing their businesses. You'll have prices that will skyrocket because we understand the supply and demand theory and how that works. I personally would hate to see that happen because I think that, yes, rules are written and regulations are set in stone, but, the world moves and we're moving at a rapid pace, and perhaps it's time to look at those regulations and say, okay, this is what the regulation was at the time. This is what it was meant to do. Life has moved on. We think that this is an acceptable way to practice these treatments if it's done in the correct way. To me, the biggest issue in the industry is not around these technicalities of the handling of S4 drugs, although I understand it's critically important. It's the skill and the training and the education of the average practitioner, whether they be nurse, dentist, doctor, dermatologist, plastic surgeon, aesthetic medicine. There is no formal training pathway. And if we are truly honest with ourselves about wanting to have better patient outcomes, we can either shut down the industry and take ourselves back to the dark ages and have this only accessible to the wealthy and the famous, or we say, let's make this industry safer. We draw a line in the sand and say, these professions, you have this level of prerequisite knowledge and education that you need to have to be to be able to practice this form of medicine. And we actually create a formal training pathway, which, there's just the examinations. It needs to be theoretical, practical, make sure that you're constantly working within your scope of practice. Do you need to have ultrasound on site? bringing the facilities up to a point where they mirror what's been done now in Tasmania. To me, that seems like the common sense approach. Shutting down 90% of an industry to me seems ludicrous. And if we're really being honest with ourselves about caring about patient safety, let's make our injectors better, because there's so many people out there who think they're doing the right thing. They're unconsciously incompetent because they've had fuck all training, because even now the training is subpar. I mean, this is a specialty. It really is.
It is, but
should be
not under the medical board, and that's they're the people who designate whether or not it's a specialty. But that's by the by.
Yeah,
We'll call it a craft group, okay? So we're a craft group. Now, number one, I'm going to say, don't I look just so smart with what I've done with ACAM, okay? Because that's exactly what we were heading for. You know, we've provided the avenues to the education because this was always going to come. The second,
but it's only for doctors, though.
It's not. ACAM is for nurses, and they are quite welcome to do the full masters through those universities with the ACAM discount. We don't require them to do that, we require them to do the diploma, but that education is fully available to all the nurses. Now, it doesn't give them S4 prescribing rights, but it does give them an education, and it is robust, and there is a workshop in there, and there is anatomy, and there is hygiene, and they're pretty robust programs. So I think
is it recognised? Is it like a government recognised formal training pathway?
Well, no, but that's accreditation, and that's what I was saying. Do we want accreditation? Okay. Accreditation and recognisation comes with those of us who work as GPs will know this, comes with a stack of other stuff that maybe you lose, and I've got to choose my words carefully here because I don't want to be seen to discouraging, engagement with the accredited colleges, but maybe you lose a little bit of your clinical freedom. And I think that, sometimes you have to be very strategic and careful. And if you self-regulate, and we are very much on point, I think, to, look at how we can move forward. But there's going to be 1,000 different opinions, and there always is. But at the end of the day, we have something established. And I would say to people, if they are feeling they want to stay in the profession, if they're feeling a little bit threatened and they feel that there are going to be these major shifts, then first look at your skill base. I think I've already said that today. Look at your skill base, look at your education. Make sure they are so gold-coated that they're gold-coated, okay? That the Anunnaki can't come down and steal your gold, so to speak, as we say. And I think that's an important consideration, It's, and as you say, people are unknowingly perhaps incompetent, but you don't know what you don't know until you know what you don't know, which means you've got to get educated. And you might find most education, did you do it again? You go, it's a bit boring, I know all this. Great. You know it all. You can validate yourself by actually understanding that you know it all. But you know what? Our anatomy lecturer, Dr Bakur, he's a professional anatomist with Griffith University, and he does from the clavicles up. So we're really talking super specialised. And he teaches our head and anatomy course. And, I'll pop in on a lecture now and again, and I go, oh, I probably didn't remember that, and I learned something every time. And I have known Mo for 15 years.
Yeah.
Okay, because he used to lecture for me privately. So I think that, that's the first thing is education. Now, the second thing is if the corporate entities want to stay within the law and the regulations, then they may think about approaching doctors to be in the clinics with the nurses, okay? So that is a way round that particular issue. Or the other thing is that, there's a lot of doctors that I don't think necessarily are at capacity that could maybe do a day. And I've suggested this to many clinics, and I've said, well, why don't you just ask if there's a doctor that wants a day's work to supervise when you can't? But the thing is that until people are forced to do something and make a decision, they're not going to make a decision because there have been alternatives there. And I think for the people who find themselves in that situation, they could also maybe approach a doctor that already has a clinic and say, I have these patients, I've been treating them for years in this environment, I would like to move my environment, et cetera, et cetera. So there will be ways, I think, around that. As for the regulations, I think overturning regulations is a very difficult thing. And I also think that this would be like on the bottom rung of the ladder. In other words, that we have a government and it's federal, remember, we have a government that is got a lot of problems at the moment and a lot of economic problems. And even if we go to them and say, this is the sector, we have seen that in other areas their ideology has ruled. So their ideology will probably rule in this and say, well, that's the regulations. You guys got to have to tough it out. And I don't think that's fair on anybody's account because people who have entered the profession under a certain set of regulations or guidelines or way of operating that have now had it changed on them, I think is a little unfair. But at the same time, I'm not a regulator. I just happen to sit on many of these panels and committees because I have a regulating background. But the other thing is I'm always trying to point out all the unintended consequences.
You mentioned about the doctor being physically on site or the prescriber being there. I mean, yes, if the regulation says that, that would be a solution. However, having a doctor, whether it's, one day a week or every day, 24/7, it doesn't actually, unless that doctor is, passionate and skilled and literally watching over the shoulder, have any tangible benefit or it doesn't change anything. They're just treating their patients in a back room in the clinic and they're there physically, but there's no tangible change, is there? It's not making practice better.
No, but from a board's point of view, and this is where everybody has to sort of, transplant their brain to a regulator point of view, they can identify who's got the obligation to the patient and who's responsible. And that's what this is about at the end of the day, okay? Because again, we go back to what the mantra of the board is, as I understand it, and that is patient safety, is it not? Patient welfare. So from a regulator's point of view, not our point of view, let's just put all our emotions and all our wants and desires under the Christmas tree over here. From their point of view, they want to be able to identify who is responsible and who is obligated to the patient. And if it is a delegated injector, it's not the delegated injector, it is the prescriber.
Sure. But that, like we've said already, that the prescriber, who, whether it's on FaceTime or in person, can easily be identified, whether it's...
Absolutely. Now it can. Now. Okay. Now.
Yes, now. But the other thing that you mentioned is that the regulator obviously has a stance, and that is formulated by lobbying and multiple people's opinion that forms the regulator's final decision. Now, and I know that they're lobbied. And I know that there are particular journalists who have a vested interest in promoting stories about where we're at, rightly or wrongly. And so maybe the regulator's opinion on what is going on the ground is not right or not at least well-informed, accurate, exactly.
Well, I would say one of the skills of the regulator, and it doesn't matter what industry you're in, okay, one of the skills of the regulator, I think they're a bit like Teflon, okay? You can lobby them. They're like Teflon, okay? Their job is to regulate. And I think they have a very good handle in all areas of regulation. Those that regulate, that hold that position, they understand it quite well. You can't lobby to them, okay? You can put your point across and they'll go, but you can't lobby to them. And they take everything.
When new regulations are sort of forewarned, there's always a period of open discussion. People can submit, all of their sort of facts and figures. So that is lobbying as far as I'm concerned. And
I would consider that feedback. So
okay, but presumably the government reads it all and makes some sort of opinion. It's not just put in the bin and disregarded.
They do. They do. I think they read them very carefully, and I think that they match them against, they have a much better understanding of the law than I do. They have a much better understanding of how the acts integrate, because that's the other thing that people forget. All these guidelines, if you look at them, they're like a jigsaw puzzle. And I think there's one more to come. And I think that, this is like they fit together. Okay. So they reflect each other. So there is an integrated plan of how they view we should operate. Now, under the matrix of the laws and the acts and the guidelines, that is what we're being told. And look, as I said, okay, we've had this one come out, but you have to remember, we were all pretty shocked in 2022 when the doctor ones came out. Yeah. And I was completely shocked. And I remember having a very heated discussion with a bunch of surgeons and saying, well, you know what, guys? I don't even operate. And it's you lot that have caused these issues, in my view. Okay? And that's because, in my view, the most sort of outstanding poor examples have technically been on the surgical side. Yes. Or whether they're just the ones that get the media attention. And here's a little tidbit for you. The worst of the worst have all been dermatologists. Every single one. And I noticed the College of Dermatology hiding in the corner there and like, don't look at me, And I sort of sit there and I go, I've done everything right. In fact, I've probably overdone it. And, here I am being subject to not restrictions, because I sort of operate that anyway, but, sort of being told off, when I've done the right thing.
Yeah.
So I get it all the way around. And the thing is that if you want to change regulation, you need a representative body. Yeah. So if we don't have a representative body that speaks in one voice, then you've got a snowball chance to begin with. And then secondly, who gets chosen to represent us? Because I think that's a really important sort of consideration, because there are going to be different points of view and different ways of operating. And again, I have said many, many times over the years, if you fail to regulate, or if we fail to regulate ourselves, we will be regulated. Yeah. And now we're regulated.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think whether you choose a nurse, plastic surgeon, cosmetic physician, we all want standards to be as best as they can be, patients to be happy and safe. And what David said before, I think we all agree with that. But I don't think we're in the same situation as the UK, where it truly is. There's liposuction being done in, beautician, anyone picking up a dermal filler and having a go. We're not there. So.
And do we want to be there? Now, let's just really think carefully about this, because, I've sort of had people say to me, well, we should just, it's so benign, we should just, unschedule it. And I'm going, no. Yeah.
But at the same time, I think we have to accept that maybe the message or the inference that the regulator has is that we are somehow there, that there are crazy things happening every day. And I don't know if the data or evidence is there. I mean, I don't know if you can speak to that, David.
Well, no, I mean, everyone goes on about patient safety, and I think it's become the term's almost become meaningless in my view, because it's just used to justify lots of things, because they'll hide behind that, but it's really,
I think sort of more corporate greed. And
it's sometimes used as a front to, because who can argue with patient safety? I mean, but I think sometimes the term's misused to then hide another agenda, which is, I don't like that this person's coming and cutting my grass and having a commercial impact on my business. Therefore, I will use the patient safety card to sort of push my point through. So I think, I mean, I'd love all these stakeholders to get together, but as you said, Gabby, it's difficult because everyone has a different view, but we are all in the same industry.
I have previously got them all together, and look, we had the same problem in the skin cancer world, and I amalgamated those two colleges. Okay, yeah. So, but that's actually not the issue. With patient safety, I'm going to go back to the insurance issue.
Yeah.
Okay, and most people sort of probably, unless you're a doctor, you don't really appreciate it. But if I put myself down for a GP procedural, my insurance is about $5,000 to $10,000 a year.
Yeah.
Okay, that's cutting off skin cancers as well. If I do cosmetic, what did I say before? I think the lowest that I know is about 42,000. Okay, so that alone, I mean, take all the distractions out, take all the emotion out. That alone tells us that the number of claims in this area, whether a doctor direct or doctor via a delegated injector, it doesn't really matter. I don't care how it comes, but the number of claims in this area, are high. That's what that tells me, that this is considered, in many respects, it is 4 times higher as a bare minimum of a GP doing the broad discipline of general practice. And it's broad, let me tell you. And that includes skin cancer because it's GP procedural, I'm sort of quoting. So, and that's anaesthetics, that's GP surgery. And so therefore, there's got to be data there. We don't have access to it.
Yes, I would challenge that because I've been on the receiving end of these things. This industry attracts people that potentially have body dysmorphic issues. People understand that if they make a claim on an insurance company, to go and defend it might cost, tens of thousands of dollars. Is it easy just to settle and then pay out? You're more likely to complain about an aesthetic outcome that's perfectly acceptable to your colleagues, but potentially not acceptable to you.
Yep.
And then that becomes a claim. So these insurance premiums, I think saying that the insurance premium amount is a direct correlation to things going wrong and that's data that shows that we're not doing a great job. I don't think you can sort of draw that conclusion from that data.
Not necessarily that we're not doing a great job. And,
and also the media. The media has a lot to do with this. The media, this is like the perfect storm for a story. It's so salacious. Everyone's interested in it for some unknown reason. Cosmetic medicine, whether it's surgery or injectables, it gets so much attention. The media does stories on it. The regulators then think, oh God, we look silly. We're going to have to do something because there's all this, publicity around this.
And remember all those journalists on a Walkley. So, and I think that, all that is valid, but at the same time, what can I say? Suck it up. That's our patient load. Okay. And I think that's, people who are interested in appearance are going to actually appear in our clinic, so to speak. Okay. And I think that's important sort of to remember that. And therefore, is it the fault of the patient or is it maybe not complete training of our clinicians that were in the situation?
Probably a bit of both, yeah.
Exactly. And we're always going to get those patients who are interested in their appearance. And I think that because if they're not, what are they doing in your clinic, so to speak? And I think this is where, again, it's that juncture. But I also think that, the media are always going to look, and there are other organisations that are going to look for the worst in us, and it's cultural. In Australia, we're a bit like the Canadians, our chocolate bar sort of thing. In America, well, you videotape your liposuction and put it on your face blog, okay? There is a difference in our approach to appearance, and it really is quite this conundrum or this matrix of cultural things that we're also dealing with because, beautiful people get paid more. But when they stuff up, we punish them 5 times as hard. And that's psychologically in the literature, okay? And I think that, we have this very, very ambivalent, quite interesting but weird sort of, relationship with physical appearance and cultural value. And, it's and it's quite funny because one of my research partners in my other area of my life, we've got some very high-tech stuff that we've got and putting in a massive data center. And I was talking to him about it. And I said, the really interesting thing, I've had so many meetings with people who put data centers together and I'm blonde and I'm female. And you know how stupid they think they are? They tell me everything. I love it. I love being blonde and female because people tell me everything. And I said to him, no, we want this, this, and this. And he's going, how do you even know about this? And I went, oh, well, I've had all these meetings and they tell me everything because they think I'm stupid. They tell me everything. So I think that we have this absolute cultural conundrum with appearance, okay? And then on the other side, and of course, Jacob, obviously the Protestant UK sort of attitude comes down. But then on the other side, we have 2-3 generations now that are used to virtual worlds, all the social media we didn't grow up with, and appearance matters there. And this is one of the things I was sort of saying to the sort of med board. It's really difficult in younger people, what we might consider classically to be maybe body dysmorphic or something like that, is actually the way they interact on social media and their social behaviour. And how do we tease that out? And again, it gets down to clinician skills. And I personally do not think there is anything wrong with looking good or your best. I actually don't have a problem with it. Okay. And I'm really old and I'm still putting my lipstick on in the morning to speak to you guys at 8:30 in the morning. I have an issue with it. Okay. But other people do. And, I think that, as I've often said to people, you do you. Okay, you just do you. If this person wants this, then I believe they have an adult choice, and it should be with registered medications in a proper environment that has all the bells and whistles, because it is a medical procedure, and this is a very important concept, not the back of the hairdressers, not the back of the beauty therapist co-located. Okay, it's a medical procedure. So you do it in medical rooms. Now, technically, there are rooms that we know don't come up to standard. So if I had one of those rooms that don't come up to standard, trust me, I would be bringing them up to standard so quick. And I think this is a really important thing. My practices have a DA. Why do they have a DA? Because they have to have a DA to run a medical practice.
Yeah.
This is a medical procedure. It's still medicine. So if we want it to be medicine, we have to behave like medics. And these are the expectations. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
definitely
totally.
does make sense. I think that was a good sort of ending to this chat. Yeah. And thank you, Gabi, for sort of summarizing your views. I know that, they may be contrary to other people, and they may be bang on line with others. It's really interesting how everyone interprets this differently. But I think you've been really clear that at least for our profession, doctors, we need to look at our CPD home and be really meticulous, because that's how we're going to be judged.
Absolutely. That's the message I interpret, and I think it's a good one for everybody to interpret that way, because these all seem to be interlocking. And I said right at the very beginning, and nobody sort of picked up on it, I said, why is the medical board running the nursing inquiry? And nobody sort of resonated. We have a nursing board because it's interlocking, okay? And that way, even though we're separate, we're still one. That's why I use the we. And there is no hierarchy. The medical board has demonstrated that, okay? There is no hierarchy. You do the deed, you're under these guidelines, that's it. And I think that, it could have been much, much worse. Okay, they can ban these medications from the country. So think about that for a minute, and then we wouldn't have access to it at all.
Oh, you were just through the black market.
Absolutely. And we've had enough issue with that as well. We've had heaps of issue with that. So, I think, yes, I can understand the negative point of view. And, as I said, my personal views are my personal views. I'm not particularly happy with some of it, but that's what I have to do to continue my craft. They're the rules until the rules change. Now, if we want to change the rules, well, then again, as you said, David, there's going to have to be demonstration we're responsible enough. Okay. Yeah. And clear lines of obligation and responsibility, because that is what the board regulates for. Okay. Otherwise, we would have Joe Bloggs being a doctor.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Fantastic. So, Gabi, thank you again for your time. I know you've got a Zoom with important space people in California, so you better make that meeting. We've got about 4 minutes till your Zoom. But thank you again for your input.
Thanks, Gabi.
Thank you for having me, guys.
For our latest news, follow us on Instagram at Inside Aesthetics Podcast. If you want to get in touch with myself or David, follow us on Instagram as well at Dr. Jake Sloan and David_Inside Aesthetics.
Join our Patreon for invaluable business and injectable education. Get access to our global community of like-minded professionals, live and interactive Zoom sessions, hints and tip videos, webinars, and more. Head over to www.insideaesthetics.com/Patreon for more information.